Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Know the Foe Bill on the Buckeyes podcast. I'm Bill Rabinowitz, and I'm joined today by Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star, who does a great job covering the formerly moribund but now resurgent Indiana Hoosiers. Zach, welcome. First of all, thank you so much for doing this.
Good to be back, Bill. Good to see you again.
I think the last time we talked was before last year's game, and Indiana was the upstart then and didn't go well. Although actually the game last year was closer than people think in a way. It was 38-15, but Ohio State scored the late touchdown after Van Anderson took a knee and they decided to score anyway. But Indiana led 7-0. We're really in the game. And then two punt plays changed it. Then Ohio State went on to win. And I thought it was interesting this week when Kurt Signetti and at least one player said, yeah, in hindsight, that game was a little too big for us at the time, and maybe we weren't ready for it. Were you taken by that?
No, I thought that was fair. I think both things can be true if you kind of look at last year's game, like you talk about that. On the one hand, Indiana was kind of hanging on. Like if you watch that game, they weren't moving the ball offensively. They couldn't flip the field at all. They couldn't, protect Curtis Rourke. They talked about how the way they'd prepared on a silent count just wasn't working. And once Ohio State timed it up, Rourke was just kind of, running for his life. Um, but in the same breath, that as you said, the final score, it's 7-7 near the end of the first half. If Indiana gets that punt away cleanly, and Indiana really hadn't had special teams issues last year, if Indiana gets that punt away cleanly, then it's probably 7-7 going into halftime, and maybe, I don't know that I'd be willing to say Indiana wins the game, but maybe Indiana loses the game with a little bit more credit. And it doesn't quite feel like the referendum that we wind up treating it as, sort of at the end of the season. Certainly, our friends down south wound up treating it as. But I do think though Indiana, both from a motivational perspective and also probably just from a structural perspective, I think sort of packaged Notre Dame and Ohio State together last year and said to themselves in the offseason, we know what we have to do. We know where we have to improve. And that was at every level. That was obviously talking about being better along the lines of scrimmage, being better, at the skill positions, being more refined in some things. But that was also, at least in as much as we've gotten to talk to Indiana's offensive and defensive coordinators, that was, coaches admitting, like Brian Haynes, Indiana's defensive coach after the Notre Dame game, admitting, maybe I was getting away from some of the stuff that had worked for us all season. That's really on me. That I wasn't staying true to what had worked, what made us sort of successful, and that's my fault. And I think that there was, Kurt Signetti is very sort of every year's a new year. Like there's no looking back. I mean, he was very purposeful about it this offseason in more ways than I can probably even remember right now in terms of saying 2024 is over, 2024 is gone. We are all eyes firmly trained on 2025. But I do think there was a lot of Indiana looking at those two games and saying, you know, we know that we were better than what the final score was in the way the game played out, but we also know that we probably weren't good enough to win either game. And now the job is to bridge that gap, basically. And, so far, they've been able to do that really in all three phases.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the talk going into the season was who was going to be the new Indiana, the team that came out of nowhere and became relevant, and not just relevant, but elite. And it turns out the new Indiana was the old Indiana. I mean, it was the Hoosiers again. Maybe you could make a case to Vanderbilt, but I mean, look, Indiana's in the playoff, no matter what. It's funny, this game means a lot. On the other hand, it means nothing, right? I mean, both teams are going to get a bye. There's almost no way, unless one team gets absolutely annihilated. Even then, I don't think that would change anything. Um, you know, but again, Ohio State hasn't won a Big Ten championship in 5 years. Indiana hasn't been in this game ever. Hasn't won a Big Ten title in hell, I don't even remember. I mean, when was it?
45 was, and it was still the old Western Conference back
Yeah, it
then.
wasn't even the Big
45 was
Ten.
the last time they won they went to the Rose Bowl in 67,
Right.
68, but like their last true conference title was 45.
Right. Um, and I was struck also this week during those conference calls that the attitude now is we can play with Ohio State. It's not David and Goliath. We feel we're on equal footing with a team like Ohio State. Um, as somebody who's watched Ohio State beat Indiana every year since 1988, you know, it's striking, but also it's true. I mean, look, Indiana and Ohio State are the only undefeated teams in the country. Indiana has blown out almost everybody they've played and won some really tough games at Oregon, obviously. Just crushed Illinois. And so anyone who doubts Indiana at this point, is truly living in the past.
No, I do think that like that attitude changed somewhere along the way. I think it was before the Oregon game, and it all does bleed together a little bit, as you know, at this time of year. Um, I think it was before the Oregon game, Aiden Fisher, who's Indiana doesn't have captains, but insofar as this team has captains, he's one of them. They just don't name
Right.
official team captains. He basically said these are the games Indiana expects to play in now, and that was God, was Oregon 3 or 2, and Indiana was 7, I think, going into that game. But it was a top 10 game. It was on CBS. It was the biggest game in the Big Ten that weekend, maybe the biggest game in the country. I forget what other. I think maybe Georgia Alabama was that weekend. I'm getting lost in my own brain. Forgive me.
We all are.
But yeah, it's I mean it's one of those weeks certainly. Um, but there was this attitude from Indiana going into that game, and others too, but that's been the most pronounced one because that's the best team Indiana's played to this point. Of you know we almost that not that it's just another game, but more the idea that we expect these moments. That we are no longer excited to play in a game like this. We're no longer sort of, just thrilled at the idea of playing in a game like this. That Fisher's message was at the start of every season, we expect to be in games like
Yeah.
this because of obviously the opponents that we're playing, but also because of the way we're playing and what
Right.
we bring to a
Right.
game like that. And then for Indiana to win that game the way they did, I mean, they sacked Dante Moore 6 times, picked him off twice. I think Oregon only had 64 total yards of offense in the second half, and like 23 or 25 of those came on the last drive of the game when Indiana was in prevent defense, just trying not to give up an easy score. I mean, it's not like Indiana was perfect that day by any means, but that was, I think, the moment when, at least as someone who has been a long-term time observer of both IU football and college football, it felt like the national conversation stopped sort of
Yeah.
referring to Indiana as a novelty and accepted the idea that if you can do that, if you can win that game the way Indiana won that game against that opponent in that stadium, then you're just one of the best teams in the country. And it really doesn't matter what your history book is. What you're doing right now is as good as anything anybody's doing. And other than maybe Ohio State. I mean that's kind of the big lingering question over Indiana this week is undeniably, Indiana deserves to be at least the number 2 team in the country, but it still has always felt like there's a little bit of a gap between everybody in Ohio State. How wide is that gap for Indiana, and can Indiana bridge that gap in 60 minutes?
Tell me how giddy people in Bloomington and Indiana are. I mean, my son went to IU. Um, I liked Tom Allen. I respected him. He got them to a certain level, but they're not even close to what they are now. I have a neighbor who's IU with IU ties who's just giddy. Um, is it like pinch me, or is it like okay, we belong now?
I think Pinch Me was more last year. I think Pinch Me was more that sudden and sort of unexpected and meteoric rise that we saw Indiana sort of go on last season. I think this year is not, I know a number of people that bought tickets to this game, especially once Indiana announced the basketball game at 2 p.m. against Louisville, and they just thought there's a chance we're doing this, and if not, we can probably move the Big Ten championship game tickets if we need to, but like let's make sure we don't miss out on
Right.
basically the once in a lifetime dream day for an IU sports fan in downtown Indianapolis. For those who don't know, their basketball plays Louisville at 2 at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, and then obviously The championship game is a little after 8 p.m. over at Lucas Oil. So there's going to be IU fans in downtown Indy basically all day.
Indiana plays basketball too.
Well, and the other thing I was about to say is I think part of what's changed, and this is a little bit reflective of sort of things that have gone on around IU basketball, but I've told people this all, I mean, for maybe 6 months now. This place has been recoded. Like this fan base is football first. And if Darren DeVries can get basketball back to the level that it, historically expects and the level that he talks about, then there will be plenty of time for basketball too. A la, I mean, you were around some of those Thad Matta, Jim Tressel sort of intersections when it felt like Ohio State was at the top of both sports annually.
Right.
But right now, if you ask the average fan, average IU fan, which team do they support? Which team is getting more of their attention? I can all but guarantee you it's
Yeah.
football. And that's, again, that is reflective of some wider cultural trends between those two sports. It's reflective, frankly, just to be fair, of 30 years of disappointment in basketball kind of manifesting themselves in fans maybe just sort of getting tired of buying into something that just
Yeah.
an investment that just kept letting them down. But a lot of it too is that, it's not just like the novelty of, hey, we're good at football again, this is fun. They've had that. They had that with back-to-back bowl games under Kevin Wilson. As you talked about it, they had it with back-to-back winning seasons under Tom Allen. I think there is a recognition that this is something different, that
Yeah.
this is something more, and that especially in this era, a school, and they claim it's the largest living alumni base. I'm sure different measures would sort of bear that out differently. It's certainly one of the largest.
Right.
And in this era, an alumni base like that, if it is properly sort of motivated and concentrated, can sustain something like this in football or in any sport that it wants to. And so, I mean, there's genuinely more energy and excitement around football right now than there is basketball. And I, is that is through no fault of Darren DeVries. That's not a criticism of Darren DeVries
Yeah.
at all. But given what Kurt Cignetti's doing, it's going to take a little bit for basketball to kind of win some of that market share back, if that's the right term.
And obviously it's only early December, and so basketball hasn't really heated up yet. So I was just curious, are you covering both games?
I will be at both. Yeah.
Wow, long day.
It's going to be, I got home from Purdue at 5 a.m. So
Ooh.
Purdue might have prepared me for Ohio State more than it prepared Indiana for Ohio State.
Long
Um,
day, lots of overtime for you.
yeah, yeah, no kidding.
uh, Let me ask the most basic question. How has Kurt Signetti done it?
Mhm. Last year I was always very hesitant to make the Saban comparison because A, no one's Nick Saban, and B, it felt lazy. And like many coaches, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but when I think about the coaches that I've talked to about their mentors, they're always quick to name the ones that you don't think of. Like Tom Crean was always quick to talk about Ralph Willard. And I don't think it was a disrespect for Tom Izzo. It was that he didn't want other people who'd been really important to his career
Right,
to not get mentioned. And I think Kurt Cignetti's the same way with Nick Saban, where it's not that he doesn't have an appreciation for his time with Saban. He just doesn't want you to forget his dad. He doesn't want you to forget, Chuck Amato. He doesn't want you to forget Walt Harris and Johnny Majors. Um, but there is a lot of what made Saban's Alabama team so tough to beat in his Indiana teams, which is they both have that coaching superpower of seemingly never failing to keep their team focused completely and utterly on what's right in front of them. And if you can beat them on talent, if you can beat them on scheme, then fair enough, you'll beat them straight up. But Indiana doesn't make mistakes. They don't, if they miss a block, it's because you beat them, not because they got confused or lazy or complacent. If this is obviously not universally true, but like if they commit a penalty, it's because you forced them to, not because they just sort of had sort of a like a brain fart moment.
right,
It is, and it's been fascinating to listen to other coaches. I think Urban Meyer has kind of led this train talk about when they watch film how well coached Indiana
yeah,
is, and you can see it in just the tiny little things, the way they block on the perimeter, the way they stay gap sound on defense. I mean, just little stuff that adds up to big stuff. Maybe the best sort of like just surface level example I can give is last season, Indiana was undeniably running up scores because they had to, and they knew it. They wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but they knew there's no quality on this resume. The way we're getting into the playoff is just by beating all the bad teams we play so badly. You cannot deny that we're one of the 12 best teams in the country. They haven't been doing that this year, and I didn't look at the Wisconsin or Purdue games yet, but Fernando Mendoza was still meaningfully involved in the offense in 4 games in their first 10. Old Dominion, because they didn't play well week one. And then Iowa, Oregon, and Penn State, the 3 road games that they kind of won in the fourth quarter. In the other 6 games through Indiana's first 10 weeks, he threw 9 total passes in the fourth quarter. They are not running up scores because they're throwing the ball downfield, because they're padding anybody's stats. It's backups and third stringers in there in the fourth quarter, and they're still moving the ball and they're still scoring the ball. And sometimes, I mean, against Illinois, Indiana's leading rusher was their third string running back. He went for over 100 yards. Almost all of them came in the fourth quarter, and a lot of them came with Indiana's backup offense on the field and Illinois' starting defense on the field. It just that is the measure of sort of like focus and sharpness and concentration and commitment and effort that Signetti gets out of this team. And yes, there's undeniably, we could talk about the talent. We can talk about, as good as Curtis Rourke was, and he was really, really good, Fernando Mendoza has been better. Obviously, some of these guys that, D'Angelo Pons is probably better this year than he was last year. Omar Cooper certainly is. Carter Smith is. Um, but the underlying sort of structural foundation of all of it is that they don't overlook anything or anyone. There's no detail too small. There's no element of preparation, too trivial. And that's why if you look at last year, they lost to the 2 teams that were better than them. And they lost, as we talked about earlier, they lost fairly decisively. You can't really make an argument that they deserve to win those games and just had some things go against them. Um, but every time they've played a team that wasn't quite as talented or wasn't quite as prepared or wasn't quite as deep, they beat them. And that is again, I'm not saying he's Nick Saban, but that is a very Saban-esque
Yeah,
quality. As somebody who did grow up in the South and grew up watching a lot of SEC football, that is a very Saban-esque quality that in his heyday, like at the height of his powers, Nick Saban would lose some games, but he would lose them on the merits of his opponent, not because his team
yeah,
was somehow
right.
unprepared. And
They
that's what Signetti
and
brings.
and that's honestly Ohio State too. Ohio State under Ryan Day has not lost. The only game they've lost with unranked opponent in his 7 years, it was last year's Michigan game, which of course, it's a different kind of game because it's the rivalry game. He has taken care of business, and Ohio State has not overlooked anybody. They went through this, November until they played Michigan was Purdue, UCLA, and Rutgers. And you knew there's no way you're going to lose those games. And I remember I wrote the story. I asked Day, are you concerned that you might not have any adversity and at some point you're going to face it, and how are you going to deal with it? And their whole thing is we play to our standard. We don't worry about the opponent. We play to our standard. And that means we don't let up. And so it sounds like they have very similar DNA in that respect. Um, but I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, if both teams are really well coached, and I think there's no question that both teams are, does Indiana have enough talent to hang with Ohio State? Look, Jeremiah Smith is probably the best offensive player in football. Julian Sand. I'm going to get to the Mendoza saying Heisman thing later, but Julian Sand's playing at a Heisman level. I mean, the highest completion percentage in NCAA history through the regular season. Caleb Downs on defense. And I know Indiana's got star players, Mendoza, Surratt. I mean, guys like that. How close is Indiana's talent to Ohio State, do you think?
Yeah, it's probably closer than it was a year ago. I don't think there's
Yeah,
any question about that. And again, I think that's a combination of upgrades at certain positions and also just growth at certain positions that,
right.
as much as people love to talk about Indiana and admire Indiana last year, sometimes you did forget that was still a roster that had come together like 9 months earlier. And yeah, you had the JMU guys, but a lot of those other players were in their first year with their position coach and their coordinator. I think there's more comfort. I think there's more depth too. There's more sort of depth of playmaking ability. Like I think it was the Illinois game. I'm almost certain it was the Illinois game where somebody pointed out to me afterward that if memory serves, and again, it's been a few weeks, so I don't remember the exact particulars, but that Mikael Kamara and Aiden Fisher, who were both All-Americans for Indiana a year ago, had combined for something like 4 tackles, and that was the entire extent of their output defensively. And they said, if I told you that before the game, like you would have thought Indiana had to win a shootout. You would have thought Indiana gave up 28 points, 31 points, something like that. And the fact that those two were so anonymous and Indiana still only gave up 10 points and the touchdown was, just one busted coverage and they win the game by 53, I think spoke to a level of talent. I think we on a lot of times it feels like we almost think of talent in terms of like how many guys did you add, and we don't think enough about talent in terms of how much better did guys get.
Right,
And I think that there have been some, Indiana's run game's a little more explosive because of Roman Hemby. Indiana's offensive line is a little bit better maybe because of Pat Coogan, although Mike Kadick was a really good center too. But I also just think a lot of these guys are better than they were a season ago. And then I think the other part of this, and you might have a different perspective on this, but like I'm fascinated by the coordinator matchups in this game because on the one side you have Matt Patricia, who is I mean probably doing the best job of any single coordinator in the country this year. On the other side, you've got Bryant Haynes, who's not far behind him, and Brian Hartline's got to call plays against him. And I know that Ryan Day's heavily involved in that in the same way that Kurt Cignetti will tell you anytime he'll always joke that anytime you ask about Mike Shanahan's offense, Shanahan's IU's offensive coordinator who's called plays for him for several years, he'll say, "Well, it's my offense, right?" Like that's kind of a joke that he always tells very dryly. But I'm fascinated by the coordinator matchup in this game too because it undeniably, and this is not, please understand, this is not like saying Ohio State's win was somehow cheapened. Like part of what Indiana could not handle, and what if you want to win at the level Indiana says it does, you need to learn to handle, is an environment like that. So much of what undid Indiana's offensive game plan last year was they couldn't handle crowd noise, they couldn't handle the field noise, and when they went to a silent count, Ohio State timed it up, and that was it. Like that was
right.
the game because Indiana could not protect Curtis Rourke or run the football. Sonny Styles had a field day, and um, as much as we can talk about, well, it was tied late in the second quarter, yeah, but Indiana wasn't moving the football, and really until the very end of the game,
Right.
never really started. I'm fascinated by the play calling matchup in this one because I think both sides are going to have some different ideas based a little bit on that talent that you're talking about, and both the raw talent and where that gap is, and then also the sort of improvement on that talent on both sides of the ball from last year to this year. And then even, like, is Indiana comfortable doing something different with Fernando Mendoza than they were Curtis Rourke? Is Ohio State comfortable doing something with Julian Sayin in a neutral environment that they were comfortable doing with Will Howard at the Horseshoe? I have no idea. I'm just fascinated by the chess match in that phase because I think we always tend to sort of look at games like this, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone in terms of this corner against that receiver, this edge rusher against that tackle, the quarterback battle, etc. I wouldn't be shocked if we come out of this and we say somebody had just a killer game plan, and as much as any one player on the field, they are the one that won fill in the blank team the game on Saturday night.
What people tend to forget about last year's Ohio State Indiana game is that Ohio State had a lot of trouble running the ball. Travion Henderson, I'm just looking it up now, had a 139-yard run. Other than that, Ohio State ran for 100 and, or I'm sorry, ran for 74 yards, 76 yards and 28 carries. And at that point last year, they had just lost, Ohio State just lost Seth McLaughlin to a torn Achilles, and their offensive line was already makeshift, and now it became more makeshift. They got it together for the playoff, but they didn't get it together the next week against Michigan, which is, a rather infamous game around here. Ohio State's line is much better now than it was at this point last year. How good is Indiana's defensive line?
I mean, it's I would say basically the same thing. And Indiana's defensive line was good last year, but again, probably was especially that Notre Dame game. And I don't know how much you watched the Notre Dame game, but
Yeah,
Ohio State a little bit, Notre Dame much more so. Like they got gashed for like a 98-yard run early. And this was where I think Brian Haynes kind of talked about getting away from some of the things that worked. Like Riley Leonard just kind of just ate him bite by bite the rest. Like it was, 5 yards, four
right,
yards, six
right,
yards. It was constantly second and manageable, third and two. And Indiana just could not get Notre Dame behind the chains at all.
right.
They have been much, much better at that this year. Not just the disruptive stuff, like that's always been a feature of Haynes' defenses, the tackles for loss numbers, the sack numbers, the pressure numbers, but forcing teams into 2nd and 8, into 3rd and 8, into 3rd and 7, forcing teams to play sort of defense advantaged football, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
That Oregon game was kind of the prime example because we can, I can take you through film of like Purdue or UCLA where they were just playing
yeah.
in the backfield
What's
all
the
night,
point?
but that
Right,
that doesn't count.
right.
But that Oregon game, I remember talking to some Oregon people in the week leading up to it and sort of suggesting that maybe this was the best defensive front Oregon had seen. And I kind of got this, well, Penn State's pretty good, Deni Dennis and Deni Dennis Sutton, and there's a lot of NFL talent on that defense. I think you're overstating, Indiana a little bit. And then Dante Moore got sacked on his first drop back. And like it was and that was, I mean, that was like a starting gun. Indiana sacked him 6 times. And they were, Oregon, I think, had something like 3 explosive plays all afternoon. Like Indiana was in the backfield all day.
Right.
By the end of the game, Oregon like was not even running two read stuff. A lot of the time, Moore was dropping back because they didn't feel like they could protect it. And I think that in as with so much about this game Saturday night, Ohio State's offensive line is probably the best Indiana's seen so far. But I think the Oregon game was as for me anyway, watching this team evolve across the last 2 years. That was the first time I felt like I was watching Indiana play at an elite level defensively against what should be an elite offense.
Right.
And that probably, I picked Indiana to go 10-2 in the preseason. I said I thought they'd make the playoff again. I think I said I thought they'd win a first round game and then lose in the quarterfinal just for posterity. I started thinking this team was capable of more when they beat Oregon, not just because it's like, okay, now they've played most of the difficult games they're going to play this season. And if you can win at Autzen, you can win anywhere, yada, yada, yada. But like the way they did it, the way they dominated the line of scrimmage in that game defensively, and even to a certain extent offensively, they weren't outstanding offensively that day, but they had 3 touchdown drives. All of them were 75 yards. All of them were at least 9 plays. Like there was only one team in that game that could genuinely claim to own the line of scrimmage, and it was Indiana. And to be able to do that against Oregon at Autzen suggested to me that if it plays well, Indiana is capable, not necessarily guaranteed, but capable of doing that against anybody.
Well,
And so I think it's, they've had some injuries. Kellen Wyatt is out for the season. Mikel Kamara's been playing a little bit banged up. On the other hand, a name fans might want to remember, Stephen Daly. He was a transfer from Kent State. Didn't come in until after the spring. Needed some time to kind of get up to speed and still managed to lead the Big Ten in tackles for loss. He has 18 tackles for loss. So they don't rotate a ton, and they really haven't had to this year because, like Ohio State, they aren't on the field a lot. Like they're playing a lot of sub 50, sub 55 snap games
yeah,
defensively. But when they have, I mean, they have proven when they've played really good offensive fronts that they can control the line of scrimmage. And I'm fascinated to see what that looks like against Ohio State because I think obviously it's going to be part of what decides this game. But I also think it is a bit of a window into what to expect out of Indiana once they get to the playoff, whoever they
okay.
face.
Let's talk about Mendoza. Fernando Mendoza comes in. Curtis Rourke again, like you said, had a good season last year, playing with a torn ACL, as it turns out.
Yeah.
Um, I think this game is going to decide the Heisman, assuming that the winner plays well. What has made Fernando Mendoza so special?
He's The best way I can describe it, and it's hard to sort of compare him to Rourke without feeling like you're damning one or the other with faint praise.
Right.
Rourke undeniably had like a consistent level that I think you saw from 5+ years of college football. The stuff he did really well. Indiana was very good at getting him to that stuff. Admittedly, also, just to be frank, Indiana, with the benefit of hindsight, was playing a lot of, mediocre to bad teams, and
Hmm.
so maybe Indiana had the opportunity to get Rourke into those moments and those positions a little bit more easily. Um, it's almost kind of harsh to say Mendoza's had shaky moments. He has, and particularly when teams have pressured him, because, and I mentioned this, he doesn't mention this, but I will. He was sacked 41 times in 12 games last year at Cal. Like there is just, and he calls them bad habits that sometimes he falls back into some of the bad habits that he learned when he just was not getting adequate protection for a quarterback in 2024 when he was with Cal. Number one, obviously, he's capable of NFL throws at a level very few quarterbacks in the country are. And I think, we've seen that in some of the drives. I mean, they're even, if you just go look at cut ups to some of the throws that he'll make, look almost effortless, in games that most people aren't watching because they don't matter. Like he had a throw against Wisconsin that he uncorked that just was sort of one. I mean, you and I have watched enough football to just
Right.
sort of say that is
That's
that
an
is a
NFL
throw that
throw.
will get him paid on Sunday. To
Yeah.
what extent, we don't know, but he's going to earn an NFL paycheck because he can do that. And the thing is, whenever you talk about, and I'm always sort of hesitant to overdo or overplay kind of either end of this assessment. But whenever you talk about, for example, the fact that he struggles at times against pressure, you also have to talk about the fact that he's been really good against it too. Penn State was bringing zero blitzes that entire drive that he comes back and wins the game in State College. The game-winning touchdown pass, if you go back, because this occurred to me the other day when I was watching some film. The game-winning touchdown pass against Iowa, against Oregon, against Penn State, all came against pressure. Every single one of them.
Yeah.
Two of the three got home. The Iowa one didn't quite, but he knew what was coming. Iowa just ran a zero blitz with single coverage. So the point is, it's almost like you're kind of grading Mendoza on a higher scale, maybe than we were grading Rourke, and that might speak a little bit to what we talked about earlier, that last year felt just kind of like a whirlwind, and you didn't really know
Yeah.
exactly what to expect of Indiana. Whereas this year, it's clear that he's a Heisman caliber player, whether he wins it or
Yeah.
not, and it's clear that Indiana is a playoff caliber team, whether it wins a national title or not. But you also can't argue with the fact that, I mean, he's been basically about as efficient as anybody in the country other than Sayan. They're almost identical in passer rating. They're almost identical in yards per attempt. Sayan's got more yards, but Sayan's also attempted about 30 more passes than Mendoza has. Mendoza's had a few games where he's not looked great. He's also had a couple games. I mean, he had, I think, 5 touchdown passes and 2 incompletions against Illinois. And again, he has led the game-winning touchdown drive. He's not just been, sort of part of it. Like he has been
Yeah.
center stage on
Yeah.
the game-winning touchdown drive in all of those one score, or I guess Oregon is by the end a two-score game
Yeah.
that Indiana, sort of puts together. He leads the nation in total touchdowns. He's got a little bit of mobility about him. He's not like true dual threat, but if you don't control the edge, he'll pull it and run. And I think the other thing too is, and I think he did this with a couple plays at Iowa. I think he's proven a toughness to his team that I think got this offense bought into the idea that, this guy will lay whatever he needs to out
Right.
there for us to
Right.
make the plays to win. And I think guys follow him for that.
Let's kind of cut to the chase here. How do you think the game plays out?
Yeah, I've made this prediction on two different podcasts now, so I don't think I can back off of it. I have Ohio State 24-19. I settled on 19, imagining Ohio State might force Indiana into a couple of field goals
Yeah.
and then get Indiana to a place where Indiana felt like it had to go for two,
Yeah.
and not get it. I do, and listen, I picked Indiana to win last year a little bit on vibes, especially after that Seth McLaughlin injury, just thinking
Yeah.
like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe all the stars are aligning, and obviously they did not. I really would not be shocked if Indiana won this game. Like if I picked Indiana last year, still knowing it would be a pretty surprising result. I would not be surprised if Indiana won this game. This is I just say this, a genuinely very, very good football team. They're experienced, they're smart, they're tough, they're really well coached. Um, but Ohio State, I suspect, is a little bit better. And I just think if I have to if I think this game is basically going to come down to a coin toss somewhere, like it's 21-19 Ohio State
Yeah,
and Indiana's going for two to try and tie it in the last 5 minutes, then I have to go with the team that I think is probably just that 2% better, and that's Ohio State. But I will say, I think, I think Ohio State's schedule's been a little bit underplayed this year. Like they've played some good teams. Um, they have not, I don't think they've played a team quite like this one. And I do think if Indiana can get ahead in this game in any meaningful way, Indiana is one of the toughest teams in America to play from behind because once they get you taking some chances, once they get you being a little bit over aggressive or feeling like you've got to get out of your game plan to catch them, they really, I mean, that's where they eat.
right.
And so I pick Ohio State. I think it's going to be a nip and tuck. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a really fun game. If for no reason other than because you said at the top, neither team really has a lot to lose. So I don't think anybody's going to be playing that tight in this game. I think we're just going to get both sides' best effort.
Right. Well, Zach, I agree with your assessment. I think it's going to be a close game and a fun game because both teams, it's not a must-win game, which may add to the fun element. So, Zach Osterman for the Indianapolis Star, thank you so much for joining the podcast and look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.